Weeks, Chapter 34. Restraining an impulse to run to the door and fling it open, Kyler stayed utterly still. No one was in the room with him, of that he was certain, but he thought, yes, he could hear someone breathing in the shop. Then he realized that it was more than one person. One was breathing quickly, shallowly, excited. The other was breathing lightly, but slowly. Not tense, not excited. That scared Kyler. Who could ambush a wet boy and not even be nervous? Afraid of losing all initiative, Kyler moved slowly toward the wall that separated the herbery from the shop. If he was right, one of the men was standing just on the other side of it. Sheathing a short sword, to be silent, he had to do it so slowly that it was painful. Kyler then drew out the Cenarian hand and a half sword he carried in a back scabbard. He brought the tip of the blade close to the wall and waited for the slightest sound. There was nothing. Now he couldn't even hear the excited man breathing. That meant the excited one must be on the other side of this wall, while the calm man was further. Kyler waited. He trembled with anticipation. One of the men on the other side of the entry was a witch. Were they with the Caledonians Jarl had warned him about? Kyler pushed the thought out of his head. He could worry about that later. Whoever they were, they had trapped him. Whether they thought he was Master Brent or just a common thief didn't matter. But which one was the witch? The nervous one? He wouldn't have thought so, but the feeling that had pressed past him and had locked the door had seemed to come from that side. A board creaked. "Fear! Back!" The man further away from Kyler shouted. Kyler rammed his sword through the finger-thick pine. He yanked the sword back as he charged through the entry. He burst through the curtain and launched himself off the doorpost and over the sales counter toward the man he tried to stab. The man was on the ground, rolling over, as Kyler took a slice at his head. He was huge, bigger even than Logan, but proportioned like a tree trunk, thick everywhere, with no definable waist or neck. For all that, even on his back, he was bringing up a sword to block Kyler's blow. He would have blocked it, too, if Kyler's sword had been whole, but half of Kyler's Cenarian blade was lying on the ground by the man, sheared off with a magic a moment after he had rammed it through the wall. Finding no sword where he expected it, the big man's parry went wide as Kyler attacked from his knees. Without the full weight of the blade, Kyler brought his half-sword down faster than the big man could react, and stabbed for his stomach. Then Kyler felt as if his head were inside the sound bow of a temple bell. There was a concussion, pitched low but focused, as if a cornerstone had fallen 2 stories and landed an inch from Kyler's head. The force blew him sideways through one shelf of herb jars and into a second, sending them crashing down underneath him. Then there was nothing but the light flashing in front of Kyler's eyes. His sword was gone. He blinked, vision slowly returning. He was face down on the floor with a shattered shelf, lying amid the remnants of broken jars and scattered herbs. He heard a grunt from the big man and then footsteps. Kyler kept still, not having to fake much to appear incapacitated. A few inches from his nose, he was slowly able to make out some of the plants. Prawnwee seed, oobdal bud, yarrow root. This shelf should have... and there it was. Near his hand, delicate tuntun seed, ground to powder. If you breathed it, it would make your lungs hemorrhage. The footsteps came closer, and Kyler lurched, spinning to one side and flinging tuntun powder in an arc. He came to his feet and drew a pair of long knives. "Enough, Shadow Strider." Air congealed around Kyler like a jelly. He tried to drive away, but the jelly became as hard as rock. The 2 men regarded Kyler through the cloud of tuntun seed hanging frozen in the air. The blond mountain folded meat slab arms across his chest. "Don't tell me you expected this, Dorian," he growled at the other man. His friend grinned. "Not much to look at, is he?" the mountain asked. The smaller man, Dorian, wore a short black beard under intense blue eyes, had a sharp nose and straight white teeth. He reached forward and took some of the floating tuntun powder between his fingers. Black hair, lightly oiled, blue eyes, pale skin, definitely Caledonian. He was the witch. "Don't be a sore loser, Fear. Things would gone badly for you if I hadn't broken this sword." Fear scowled. "I think I could hold my own." Actually, if I hadn't intervened right now, he'd be wondering how he was going to move such a large corpse, and that was without his talent. That got an unhappy grunt. The smaller man waved a hand, and the tuntun powder fell to the ground in a tidy pile. He looked at Kyler, and the bonds holding him shifted, forcing him to stand upright, with his hands down at his sides, though still holding the knives. "Is that more comfortable?" he asked, but didn't seem to expect a reply. He touched Kyler's hand with a single finger and stared into him as if his eyes were cutting him open. He frowned. "Look at this," he said to Fear. Fear accepted the hand Dorian put on his shoulder and stared at Kyler the same way. Kyler stood there, not knowing what to say or do, his mind filled with questions that he wasn't sure he should give voice to. After a long moment, Fear said, "Where's his conduit? It almost seems shaped like there's a niche for—" He exhaled sharply. "By the light, he ought to be—" "Terrifying, yes," Dorian said. "He's a born cacarifer. But that's not what worries me. Look at this." Kyler felt something twist in him. He felt as if he were being turned inside out. Whatever he was seeing, it scared Fear. His face was still, but Kyler could almost feel the sudden tension in his muscles, the slight tang of fear in the air. "There's something here that resists me," he said. "The stream's winning. The shadow cloaked makes it worse." "Let it go," Fear said. "Stay with me." Kyler felt whatever had been pulling him open drop away, though his body was still bound in place. Dorian rocked back on his heels, and Fear grabbed his shoulders in meaty hands and held him up. "What'd you call me? Who are you?" Kyler demanded. Dorian smirked, regaining his balance as if by the force of good humor alone. "You ask who we are, wearer of names. It's Kyler now, isn't it? Old Jirian punning. I like it. Was that your sense of humor or Blent's?" At the startled look on Kyler's face, he said, "Blent's, apparently." Dorian looked through Kyler again, as if there were a list inside him that he was reading. The nameless, Mariati, Queller, Specs, Kyler, even Kage. Not terribly original, that. "What?" Kyler asked. This was ridiculous. Who were these men? "Sakage means Lord of Shadows," Dorian said. "Thus Kage means shadow, but I don't suppose that one's your fault. In any case, you ought to be more curious. Did it never occur to you to wonder why your peers had common names like Jarl or Bem, or slave names like Doggerel or Rat, and you were burdened with Azoth?" Kyler went cold. He'd heard that witches could read minds, but he'd never believed it, and those names, that wasn't a random list. "You're witches, both of you." Fear and Dorian looked at each other. "Half right," Dorian said. "Well, a little less than half, really," Fear said. "But I was a witch," Dorian said, "or more properly a meister. If you ever have the misfortune of meeting one, you may not want to use a slur." "What are you?" Kyler asked. "Friends," Dorian said. "We've made a long journey to help you. Well, not only to help you, but to help and we've come at great peril, personal cost, and greater risk," Fear interrupted, looking at Dorian sharply. "We hope you have no doubt that we could kill you, that if we wished you harm, we could have done it already," Dorian said. "There are more types of harm than just killing. A wet boy knows that," Kyler said. Dorian smiled, but Fear still looked wary. Kyler felt the bonds release him. That unnerved him. They'd seen how fast he could move, and yet they released him. Armed. "Allow me to introduce us," Dorian said. "This is Fear Kosat, one day to be the most renowned swordsmith in all Midicrew. He's a Visayan and a blade master of the second Econ." "Great. And you?" Kyler asked. "You won't believe me," Dorian said, enjoying this. "Try me. I'm Caesarian and Hofsalar, and once a Verdmeister of the 12th Shura." "Impressive." Kyler had no idea what those were. "What should be important to you is that I am a prophet. My name is Dorian," Dorian said with a native Caledonian accent. "Dorian Ursel." "You were right," Fear said. "He doesn't believe you." Aside from carelessness, the only things that could kill wet boys were other wet boys, mages, and witches. In Blint's estimation, witches were the worst. He hadn't neglected Kyler's education. "Let me see your arms," Kyler said. "Ah, so you know about the Ver," Dorian said. "How much do you know about them?" Dorian bared his arms to the elbows. There were no marks on them. "I know that all witches have them, that they grow in proportion to the witch's power, and their intricacy shows the witch's level of mastery," Kyler said. "Don't do it, Dorian," Fear said. "I'm not going to lose you over this. Let's tell him the words and get the hell out of here." Dorian ignored him. "Only men and women who are talented can use the Ver. It's easier to manipulate than the talent and more powerful. It's also terribly addictive, and if one dares speak in moral absolutes, which I do, it's evil," Dorian said, his eyes bright, holding Kyler. "Unlike the talent, which can be good or bad, like any talent, it is in itself evil, and it corrupts those who use it. It has proven useful to my family to have all Meisters marked. So they are. My ancestors never saw any reason to be marked ourselves unless we so choose. The Ursels can make their Ver disappear at will, so long as they aren't using it." "Blint must have skipped a few lessons," Kyler said. "A pity it is, too. We're the most dangerous Vermeisters you could possibly imagine." "Dorian, just tell him the words. Let's—" "Fear!" Dorian said. "Silence. You know what do." The big man obeyed, glowering at Kyler. "Kyler," Dorian said, You're asking a drunkard who's quit drinking to take just one glass of wine. I'll live in misery for weeks for this. Fear will have to watch me constantly to see that I don't slip away to that madness. But you're worth it. Fear's mouth tightened, but he didn't say a word. Dorian held his arm out, and a shimmer passed over them. As Kyler stared at them, it looked as if the veins deep in the man's arms were wriggling, struggling to get to the surface of his skin. Then rapidly they rose all together. Dorian's arms turned black like a million fresh tattoos were being inked over each other. Layer knotted on layer, each distinct, interlocking with those below and above. Darker over lighter, with darker still coming in above. It was beautiful and terrible. The verse swelled with power and moved, not just with Dorian's arms, but independently. It seemed that they wanted to burst free of the confines of his skin. The darkness of the verse spread to the room, and Kyler was sure it wasn't his imagination. The ver were sucking the light from the room. Dorian's eyes dilated until the cool blue irises were tiny rims. A fierce joy rose in his face, and he looked 10 years younger. The ver started to swell, crackling audibly. Fear picked up Dorian like most men might pick up a doll and shook him violently. He shook and didn't stop shaking. It would have been comical if Kyler weren't too scared to move. Fear just shook and shook until the room was no longer dark with power. Then he set Dorian down in a chair. The man groaned and abruptly looked frail and older once more. He spoke without raising his head. I'm glad you're convinced, Shadow Strider. It had convinced him, but Dorian couldn't know that. How do I know it wasn't an illusion? Kyler asked. Illusions don't suck light. Illusions, Fear said. He's just being stubborn, Fear. He believes. Dorian glanced at Kyler and quickly looked away. He groaned. Ugh, I can't even look at you now. All your futures. He squeezed his eyes shut. What do you want from me? Kyler asked. I can see the future, Nameless One, but I am only human, so I pray that I could be wrong. I pray that I'm wrong, but everything I've seen, if you don't kill Durzo Blint tomorrow, Kalidor will take Cenaria. If you don't kill him by the day after that, everyone you love will die. Your Sakage Count, the Shinga, your friends, old and new, all of them. If you do the right thing once, it will cost you a year of guilt. If you do the right thing twice, it will cost you your life. So that's what this is. All this is just a setup, so I'll betray Master Blint? Did your masters think I would buy it? Kyler said. Oh, you learned a lot about me. Must have cost a fortune to buy all that information. Dorian held up a wary hand. I don't ask you to believe it all now. It's too much all at once. I'm sorry for that. You think now that we're Caledorians, and we want you to betray Blint so that he can't stop us. Maybe this will convince you that you're wrong. What I beg of you, above all else, is that you kill my brother. Don't let him get the Kakari. Kyler felt as if he'd just been stung. The what? Fear, Dorian said. Say the words we came to say. Ask Mama Kay, Fear said. He shook his head. Wait, what? Ask her about the Kakari? Ask Mama Kay, Fear said. What about your brother? Who is he? If I tell you now, you'll lose when you fight him. Dorian shook his head, but still didn't look at Kyler. Damn this power. What good is it if I can't tell you in a way you'll understand? Kyler, if time is a river, most people live submerged. Some rise to the surface and can guess what's going to happen next, or can understand the past. I'm different. When I don't concentrate, I detach from the flow of time. My consciousness floats above the river. I see 1,000 paths. Ask me where a leaf will fall, and I couldn't tell you. There are too many possibilities. There's so much noise, like I'm trying to follow a drop of rain from the clouds to a lake, then over a waterfall and pick it out in the river 2 leagues downstream. If I can touch someone or chant rhymes, it gives me focus. Sometimes. Dorian seemed to be looking through the wall, lost in reverie. Sometimes, he said, sometimes when I transcend the river, I start to see a pattern. Then it isn't like water. It's a fabric made up of every insignificant decision of every peasant as much as it is of great decisions by kings. As I begin to comprehend the vastness and intricacy of that scheme, my mind starts to pull apart. He blinked, and he turned his eyes to Kyler. He squinted, as if even looking at him caused him pain. Sometimes it's merely images, totally unbidden. I can see the anguish on the young man's face who will watch me die, but I don't know who he is, or when that will be, or why he'll care. I know that tomorrow a square vase will give you hope. I see a little girl crying over your body. She's trying to pull you away, but you're too heavy. Away from what? I don't know. Kyler felt a chill. A girl? When? Was it Lena Drake? I can't tell. Wait. Dorian blinked and his face went rigid. Go. Go now. Ask Mama Kay. Fear threw open the front door. Kyler stared from one mage to the other, stunned at the abruptness of his dismissal. Go, Fear said. Go! Kyler ran into the night. For a long moment, Fear stared after him. He spat. Still staring into the depths of the night, he said, What didn't you tell him? Dorian let out a shaky breath. He's going to die, no matter what. How does that fit? I don't know. Maybe he's not what we'd hoped.